Now let's take a look at the cost approach. And I like to think of this as the bricks and mortar approach to appraising. So with the cost approach, there's a math formula that I want you to remember. And it goes like this. We take the replacement cost of the property, and we'll define what that is in a minute. And we subtract from that any depreciation that the property has undergone over the years. Then we add to that the current value of the land, and that gives us the appraised value based on the cost approach. So let's take a look at these individually. First of all, replacement cost. Replacement cost is defined as the amount of money required to build a reasonable duplicate of the building at today's prices. Remember, we talked in another lesson about cost. Cost, as defined by an appraiser, is the amount to build a building brand new at today's prices. Why? Well, even if the property is, let's say, 20 years old, in the last 20 years, the cost of bricks and mortar and lumber and nails and all the other things that go into building a building has probably increased. And if we were to build that today, we would have to build it at today's prices. Now, in order to arrive at replacement cost, appraisers use services such as Marshall & Swift, where they have handbooks, or they actually just go online today and get information. For example, a framed stucco building in the southwestern United States. What would it cost to build that? Build a reasonable duplicate at today's prices. And these services, such as Marshall & Swift, appraisers rely on them quite frequently. Let's compare, however, replacement cost versus reproduction cost. Remember, replacement cost is the cost to build a reasonable duplicate at today's prices. Reproduction cost is the cost to build an exact duplicate. Now, it's pretty rare that an appraiser would actually utilize reproduction cost. One example might be if it was a historical property, a property where they had to rebuild it exactly as it was built. And that would probably cost a lot more because of the specialized nature of the improvements. Now, let's talk about the depreciation. Now, in another lesson, we talked about the different types of depreciation. And the appraiser would utilize his or her expertise to say, okay, the property has depreciated in line with other properties in the neighborhood. Maybe the property is in greater physical shape than a lot of others, so the appraiser might minimize the amount of depreciation. Or maybe the property is really in a deteriorated condition compared to other properties in the area, and therefore the appraiser would then use a greater amount of depreciation. And again, these services like Marshall & Swift's Cost Handbook also give an appraiser an idea of what numbers, what percentages to apply to the depreciation. So once the appraiser has calculated the replacement cost and estimated the depreciation, we arrive at a depreciated cost of the building. In other words, now we have the building sitting up in midair, so to speak, because we haven't touched the land yet, and we have the building brand new, but then we've depreciated it down to represent its value in its current condition. Finally, we're going to go to the land, and the appraiser would typically use the market data approach to arrive at and estimate the value of the land that is under the buildings. And once the appraiser estimates that land value, they can add that into the depreciated value of the building, and that gives the appraiser the appraised value based on the cost approach. Now, one of the questions you might ask is, how do you arrive at the square footage of the building? Because most of the time, real estate agents and appraisers are talking about square footage. Well, the term that actually applies here is square footage of living area. If you go on the county assessor's website, they're quoting the square footage of living area. When an appraiser estimates the value of a property, they base it on the square footage of living area. Be careful, square footage of living area is defined differently than square footage under roof. So the square footage of living area is determined by taking the measurements of the exterior of the building from the outside in because you build buildings from the outside in. Of course, leaving off any garages, carports, porches, etc. So if we have a diagram here, and this may be a little bit difficult for you to see, but here's a diagram of a floor plan of a house. The square footage of living area would be measured by taking the exterior dimensions of the exterior walls. You would exclude that entryway. You would exclude the garage. You would exclude the back patio. You also exclude, if it's a ranch-style house and it has eaves, you would also exclude those eaves. You know, I remember when I first got in the real estate business, a seller asked me how big his home was. And I had a tape measure, and somebody told me to take a tape measure with me. So I proceeded to say, well, I'll tell you in a little bit. And I got my tape measure out, and I started to measure the inside of the bedroom and the inside of the closets and so on. And finally, the seller said to me, well, why don't we just go outside and measure the outside of the building? I said, good idea. Well, when I got back to the office, I asked around, and I found out that that's the way you do it. You measure the exterior of the building, because you build buildings from the outside in, and that's known as the square footage of living area. Now, the cost approach is relied on most heavily when you have unique properties, one-of-a-kind type properties. Municipal buildings, for example, or churches, or schools, or certainly unique residential or commercial properties where there's really no data available. So that's where the cost approach would be relied on most heavily. Of course, new construction, brand new homes, you have no depreciation, so you only have two factors. You have the land value and, of course, the replacement cost. And since there's no depreciation, it's a lot easier to utilize the cost approach on new construction. So that's our discussion on the comparison and cost approaches. In another lesson, we're going to look at the income approaches to appraisal.